Hello and welcome to my channel. Close your eyes, lean back, immerse yourself in the story, and get ready to drift off to sleep in peace. Relax, subscribe, and leave a comment. Picture a night so cold that the air itself seems to crack. Somewhere in northern Europe, 7 centuries ago, snow presses against the walls of a low timber house, and inside, a single fire struggles to hold back a darkness that is not just the absence of light, but the absence of heat. This was not fiction. During the coldest stretches of the medieval period, particularly in the centuries that historians now call the early phase of the Little Ice Age, temperatures in parts of Scandinavia, the Baltic, and inland Russia could plunge to extremes rarely seen in modern life, sometimes far below anything a person today would willingly step outside into. It is important to be precise here. A reading of 50 degrees below zero was not an ordinary winter night across all of medieval Europe. It was an extreme, recorded mostly in the harshest interior regions of the north and east, where continental winds met unforgiving cold fronts with no ocean nearby to soften them. But when such cold did arrive, it tested every method a peasant family had for staying alive until morning. This is the story of those methods, built not from myth, but from the tools, homes, and habits that archaeology and historical record have left behind. Chapter 2: The Shape of a Peasant Home. Long before central heating, before glass windows, before insulation as we understand it, survival began with the shape of the house itself. Medieval peasant dwellings, especially in the coldest regions, were built low, small, and simple, not out of poverty alone, but out of necessity. A smaller room held heat more efficiently than a large one. Ceilings were kept low. Doorways were narrow and often covered with heavy cloth or hide rather than left as open thresholds. Walls were built thick, packed with clay, moss, or straw between wooden beams, a technique known as wattle and daub, which trapped air within its layers and slowed the escape of warmth. In the coldest northern farmsteads, some homes were built partly into the earth itself, using the ground as natural insulation, since soil below the frost line holds a steadier temperature than open air. Roofs were thatched thick with straw or reed, sometimes over a foot deep, both to shed snow and to hold in heat that rose from below. Every choice, from wall thickness to roof pitch, was a quiet negotiation with the cold. Chapter 3: The Hearth as the Center of Life. At the heart of nearly every peasant home stood the hearth, and in the coldest climates, its role went far beyond cooking. In much of medieval Russia and parts of Eastern Europe, families built large masonry stoves, sometimes called stone or clay ovens, that were designed specifically to hold heat for hours after the fire itself had died down. These stoves were often built large enough that family members could sleep directly on top of them, using the stored warmth of the masonry as a bed through the night. This was not a luxury but a practical solution to a genuine threat, because a fire left burning unattended risked filling a small, sealed home with smoke, while a fire allowed to die completely risked the opposite danger, a slow and silent drop into deadly cold. Peasant households became skilled at banking their fires, covering embers with ash to keep them alive, but low, ready to be coaxed back into flame at first light. Wood, peat, and dried dung were all used as fuel depending on the region, each chosen based on what the local landscape could provide. Chapter 4: Layers instead of machines. Without electric heat or modern fabrics, the peasant answer to cold was addition rather than invention, layer upon layer of material, each one trapping a thin cushion of warm air against the body. Wool was the great workhorse of medieval clothing, valued for a quality still recognized today, its ability to retain warmth even when damp. A peasant preparing for a brutal winter night did not simply wear more clothes. They wore clothes designed to nest together. Coarse outer garments over softer inner layers, with the goal of sealing in body heat rather than blocking wind alone. Fur, when available, was reserved for extremities and outerwear, since animal pelts offered insulation that plant fibers alone could not match. Felted wool caps, mittens, and wrapped leg coverings protected the parts of the body that lost heat fastest. Even bedding followed this same logic. Peasant did not simply lie beneath a single blanket. They built a small architecture of straw mattresses, woolen coverings, and sometimes furs, each layer designed to trap still air, the true enemy of cold not being low temperature alone, but moving air stealing heat from the skin. Chapter 5: Sleeping Together, Not Alone. Perhaps the most overlooked tool against extreme cold was other people. In medieval peasant households, privacy as it is understood today simply did not exist in the way modern life assumes. Families slept together, often in a single room, sometimes in a single bed, not merely from lack of space, but because shared body heat was a genuine survival strategy. Parents, children, and sometimes grandparents occupied the same sleeping platform, arranged so that the coldest positions near walls or doors were filled by adults, while children were placed toward the center, where warmth pooled most reliably. In many farming households across northern Europe, livestock played a similar role. Cattle, goats, or pigs were sometimes housed in an attached section of the home, or even within the same single room, separated only by a low partition. This was not simply about convenience or protecting animals from predators. A full-grown cow produces a considerable amount of body heat, and in the harshest recorded winters, that heat could mean the difference between a survivable night and a fatal one. Chapter 6: Food as Fuel for the Body. Warmth did not come only from walls and blankets. It came from within. Medieval communities living through severe winters understood, even without modern science to explain it, that the body needed fuel to generate its own heat. Diets shifted with the season, leaning more heavily on stored grains, dried meats, root vegetables, and preserved fats, foods that provided the dense energy needed to keep the body's internal furnace running through long, dark nights. Hearty pottages, thick stews built from whatever grain, vegetable, and preserved meat a household had put aside, were common winter staples, eaten warm whenever fuel allowed, and packed with the calories a cold climate demanded. Fat, in particular, was prized in the depths of winter far more than in warmer months, since it offered the slowest, most sustained source of energy the body could draw upon through a freezing night. A peasant's winter diet, in this sense, was not separate from their sleeping strategy. It was part of the same system, the same quiet, practiced defense against a season that could kill. Chapter 7: When the Cold Won. For all their skill and preparation, medieval peasants were not immune to the dangers of extreme cold, and historical records make this painfully clear. Frostbite, hypothermia, and death from exposure were real and documented threats, particularly for the very young, the very old, and the poorest households who lacked sufficient fuel or livestock to share warmth. Chroniclers writing during the harshest recorded winters of the medieval period describe rivers freezing solid enough to cross on foot, livestock dying in the fields, and desperate households burning furniture, and in the direst cases even parts of their homes, simply to survive until dawn. Village communities often responded with collective strategies, families without adequate shelter or fuel taking refuge with neighbors, and in some regions, local lords or church institutions distributing firewood or grain to the most vulnerable during the worst stretches of winter. Survival, in the harshest years, was rarely an individual achievement. It was a community effort, built on shared resources and mutual dependence, because in the coldest medieval winters, no single household stood entirely alone. Chapter 8: What Their Winters Teach Us. Looking back at how medieval peasants endured nights of extraordinary cold, what emerges is not a story of primitive hardship, but one of quiet, accumulated intelligence. Every element, the low, thick-walled house, the carefully tended hearth, the layered clothing, the shared bed, the calorie-rich winter diet, worked together as a single, coherent system, refined over generations of trial, failure, and adaptation. These were not people waiting passively for warmer weather. They were people who studied their environment closely enough to build a life that could withstand it, using only the materials the land itself provided. In an age without thermometers or weather forecasts, they still understood, in a deeply practical sense, exactly what the cold demanded of them, and they answered it, night after night, winter after winter, for centuries. Chapter 9: A Colder Age Than We Imagine. To understand why medieval winters could turn so severe, it helps to understand the climate itself was not static. For much of the high and late medieval period, Europe experienced a long, gradual cooling trend that climatologists now call the Little Ice Age, a shift that began to take hold from roughly the 13th century onward and deepened in the centuries that followed. This was not a single event, but a slow tightening of conditions, shorter growing seasons, harsher frosts, and winters that arrived earlier and lingered longer than in the warmer centuries before. Tree ring records, ice cores, and the written accounts of monks and merchants all point to the same pattern, a climate turning colder, just as medieval populations were adapting the very homes, diets, and farming methods this story has described. It was against this backdrop, not in an average year, but in the coldest stretches of an already cooling age, that temperatures in the harshest interior regions could fall to the extremes that make this story worth telling at all. Peasants did not know the name Little Ice Age. They only knew that some winters were survivable, and some tested every method they had. Chapter 10: The Northern Farmstead. In Scandinavia, where daylight itself nearly vanished for weeks at a time, peasant life adapted around winter with a thoroughness found almost nowhere else in medieval Europe. Norwegian and Swedish farmsteads often clustered several buildings closely together, a main house, a barn, a storehouse, connected by covered passages, or built so close that moving between them required only a few steps outside. This clustering reduced the exposure of daily chores to the brutal outside air and allowed heat from the animal barn to indirectly warm the adjoining walls of the living quarters. Turf roofs, thick layers of soil and grass laid over a wooden frame, were common across the region, offering insulation that ordinary thatch could not match, since living turf trapped air within its root systems even through the coldest months. Norse households also relied heavily on a long central hall design, where the fire pit ran down the middle of a single large room, allowing heat to radiate evenly rather than concentrating in one corner. Sleeping benches lined the walls of these halls, close enough to the central fire to catch its warmth, while thick-woven wall hangings helped to trap heat and block drafts seeping through timber joints. Chapter 11: Survival on the Russian Plain. Few regions of medieval Europe faced colder, more sustained winters than the interior plains of Russia, where the absence of any moderating sea left the land exposed to brutal continental cold fronts sweeping in from the northeast. It was here, more than almost anywhere else, that the masonry stove reached its fullest development, known in later centuries by the name peck. These large clay or brick structures dominated the interior of a peasant home, sometimes taking up a quarter of the entire living space. Built to absorb and slowly release heat over many hours, the stove was fired particularly for the elderly and the very young, who were most vulnerable to the cold. Russian peasant homes were also built notably compact and low, with small windows, sometimes no more than narrow slits covered by stretched bladder or thin wood, since every opening was a place where hard-won heat could escape into the freezing night outside. Chapter 12: Milder but not mild, the British and Western Experience. Across the British Isles and much of Western Europe, winters were generally less extreme than in Scandinavia or Russia, tempered by the moderating influence of the Atlantic. Yet even here, the coldest years of the Little Ice Age brought hardship that pushed peasant households to their limits. English manorial records from particularly severe winters described frozen rivers, failed harvests from the previous autumn compounding winter hunger, and livestock losses that could cripple a household for years. Timber-framed cottages, filled between their beams with wattle and daub, offered reasonable but imperfect insulation, and smoke from open hearths often had no proper chimney to escape through, until later medieval centuries, curling instead through a hole in the thatch above. Families packed straw thickly into sleeping areas, layered woolen blankets, and in the poorest households, slept close to whatever animals they kept. A single cow or a few sheep often housed at one end of a long, single-room dwelling known in some regions as a longhouse, its design placing people and livestock under one roof by deliberate design rather than accident. Chapter 13, Life Above the Snow Line. In the mountain valleys of the Alps and other high, isolated regions, winter posed a different kind of challenge, not only cold but prolonged isolation, as snow could seal off a village from the outside world for months at a time. Alpine peasant households prepared for this isolation with meticulous care, since a shortage discovered in the middle of winter could not simply be resolved by travel to a neighboring town. Homes were built low and solid, often with stone lower walls and timber upper stories, oriented deliberately to minimize exposure to prevailing winds. Livestock stables were frequently built directly beneath the living quarters, allowing rising heat from the animals below to warm the family's rooms above, a vertical arrangement of shared warmth rather than the horizontal one seen in northern longhouses. Grain, cheese, cured meat, and dried fruit were stored in quantities meant to last through complete isolation, and firewood was gathered and stacked with an intensity that reflected a simple, unforgiving truth. Once the snow closed the passes, there would be no second chance to prepare. Chapter 14, The Youngest and the Oldest. Within every household, the burden of extreme cold did not fall equally. Infants, young children, and the elderly faced the greatest danger, their bodies less able to generate or retain heat compared to adults in their prime. Medieval families responded to this reality with practical, often ingenious adjustments. Infants were swaddled tightly in layers of wool and linen, then kept as close to the body of a parent or older sibling as possible through the night, since an infant's survival often depended less on blankets alone than on constant, direct contact with another person's warmth. The elderly, meanwhile, were frequently given the most favorable sleeping positions in the household, nearest the hearth or atop a heated stove platform, where one existed, a recognition, whether stated outright or simply understood, that their bodies had less reserve left to fight off the cold. Village and church records from the hardest winters do still report deaths among the very young and very old at rates far higher than among adults, a somber reminder that even the most careful preparation could not fully overcome the extremes nature was capable of delivering. Chapter 15, The Animals That Kept Them Alive. Livestock in a medieval peasant household were never simply property. In the depths of winter, they were active partners in survival. Beyond the raw body heat, a cow, goat, or pig could contribute to a shared living space. Animals represented a form of stored biological energy the family could draw upon in the most desperate circumstances, whether through milk, through the careful management of feed to keep breeding stock alive. Until spring, or in the direst years, through slaughter when starvation became the greater threat. Keeping livestock alive through winter was itself a demanding task, requiring feed to be gathered and stored across the entire growing season, hay cut and dried, root vegetables set aside, since a family that failed to feed its animals through winter risked losing not just warmth, but their entire economic foundation for the year ahead. The placement of animals within or beside the home was therefore never accidental. It reflected a careful calculation, balancing the warmth their presence provided against the space, smell, and labor their care demanded, a trade-off medieval households across nearly every region of Europe judged, again and again, to be worth making. Chapter 16, Spinning Wool Against the Cold. Behind every layer of winter clothing lay months of unseen labor, and nowhere was this more true than in the production of wool. Long before winter arrived, households spent countless hours through spring, summer, and autumn shearing sheep, cleaning and carding raw fleece, spinning it into thread by hand, and weaving that thread into the coarse, dense cloth that would become the season's primary defense against the cold. This was overwhelmingly the work of women and girls within a peasant household, often carried out during any spare moment, by firelight in the evening, while minding livestock, while children played nearby, since the volume of cloth a family needed to survive winter could not be produced quickly. Wool's particular value lay in a quality medieval households understood through direct experience, even without scientific explanation. Its fibers trapped air efficiently and continued to insulate even when damp with sweat or melted snow, a critical advantage over plant fibers like linen, which lost much of their warmth once wet. The finished cloth was rarely wasted or discarded. Garments were mended, layered, and passed down, and worn-out wool was often repurposed as stuffing for mattresses or additional insulation pressed into the gaps of a home's walls. Chapter 17, Gathering Fuel Before the Frost. No fire could burn through winter without fuel gathered long in advance, and the labor of preparing enough wood, peat, or dried dung to last the coldest months was one of the most physically demanding tasks of the entire agricultural year. In forested regions, this meant felling and hauling timber through the autumn, splitting and stacking it to dry before the first hard frost made the ground too difficult to work. In regions where woodland was scarce, particularly in parts of the treeless plains and moorlands, peasant households turned to peat, cut from bogs in slabs during the drier months and left to dry through summer before being stored for winter burning. Dried animal dung, mixed sometimes with straw, served a similar purpose in areas where neither wood nor peat was abundant. Practical solution that turned an ordinary byproduct of livestock, keeping into a genuine lifeline against the cold. Manorial and village records from across medieval Europe frequently regulated access to common woodland and peat bogs with real seriousness, since a household that failed to secure sufficient fuel before winter closed in faced a threat every bit as serious as a poor harvest. Chapter 18, Folk Remedies Against the Cold's Toll. When the body's own defenses against cold began to fail, medieval households turned to a body of practical, hard-won folk knowledge, imperfect by modern medical standards, but grounded in generations of direct observation. Frost-bitten fingers and toes were treated with gradual warming, wrapped in cloth, and brought slowly back toward the heat of the fire, rather than plunged directly into it. An instinctive understanding that sudden extreme heat could do further damage to already injured tissue. Warm broths and spiced, heated drinks were given to those who had been dangerously chilled, both to restore warmth from within and to encourage circulation. Herbal preparations, often passed down through generations of village healers, were applied to chilblains and cold sores that plagued hands and feet through the winter months. Physicians trained in the university medical tradition of the later medieval period, drawing on classical humoral theory, advised warming foods and drinks for those suffering the effects of extreme cold, a formal medical framework, despite its very different scientific basis, arrived at. Practical advice not far removed from what village healers already practiced by instinct and experience. Chapter 19, A Village Working as One. Extreme winter cold rarely tested a single household in isolation. It tested the resilience of an entire community. Manorial and village records from the harshest recorded winters describe a range of cooperative responses that speak to just how deeply survival depended on collective effort. Wealthier households or the local manor lord sometimes distributed surplus grain or firewood to tenants who had fallen short, not purely from generosity, but from a practical recognition that a village weakened by mass starvation or death served no one's long-term interest. Neighbors took in families whose homes had become uninhabitable, whether from a collapsed roof under heavy snow or simply insufficient fuel to keep a fire burning. Communal ovens, where they existed, allowed households to share the labor and fuel cost of baking bread, a small but meaningful efficiency in a season where every log and every hour of labor carried added weight. Even the shared management of woodland, pasture, and water sources, already a defining feature of medieval village life, took on sharper urgency in winter, since resources that might be taken for granted in summer became matters of survival once the frost set in. Chapter 20: The Winters That Broke Records. Historical chronicles preserve accounts of specific winters, so severe they were remembered and written about for generations afterward. Sources describing the early 14th century, a period historians associate with the onset of colder, Little Ice Age conditions, combined with catastrophic harvest failures, record rivers across northern Europe freezing solid enough to bear the weight of loaded carts, vineyards destroyed by frost. As far south as regions unaccustomed to such extremes, and widespread livestock deaths that compounded an already dire subsistence crisis. Chroniclers wrote of desperate households burning furniture, fences, and in the direst reported cases, stripping timber from their own homes simply to keep a fire alive through the worst nights. These were not ordinary winters, even by the standards of a colder age. They were the outer edge of what medieval society, for all its careful preparation, could reasonably withstand. Such years left lasting scars on the communities that survived them, shaping the traditions of stockpiling, communal aid, and careful winter preparation that later generations continued to practice long after the immediate crisis had passed. Chapter 21: Faith, Ritual, and the Turning of the Season. Winter in medieval Europe was not endured through practical measures alone. It was framed, understood, and made bearable through faith and ritual. The Christian liturgical calendar placed some of its most significant observances directly within the darkest, coldest months, Advent, the feast of Saint Nicholas, and Christmas itself falling in the very heart of winter's grip. These occasions offered more than spiritual meaning. They provided structure, anticipation, and moments of shared warmth and gathering that broke the isolation of the season. Communities marked the winter solstice and the slow, gradual return of daylight with observances that blended older folk tradition and Christian practice, a recognition, expressed through ritual rather than science, that the coldest depths of winter also marked the turning point toward eventual relief. Prayers for protection through the winter months, blessings asked over stores of grain and firewood, and communal feasts held when resources allowed, all served a purpose beyond the purely religious, reinforcing the sense that a community faced the season together, bound by shared belief as much as by shared walls and shared fires. Chapter 22: What Endured. By the time spring finally loosened winter's hold, a medieval household that had survived the coldest months had done so through no single solution, but through the patient accumulation of countless small decisions: a wall built thick enough, a stove fed carefully enough, a store of grain measured out precisely enough to last, a bed shared closely enough to hold in warmth through the longest nights. None of these measures alone could guarantee survival against the very worst that a medieval winter, at the height of the Little Ice Age, was capable of producing. Together, refined over generations, and adapted to the particular demands of each region, they formed a system resilient enough to carry ordinary families through extraordinary cold again and again for centuries. What remains today, in archaeological remains, in the surviving design of old farmhouses, in written chronicles of the hardest years, is a testament not to primitive struggle, but to a deep, practical mastery of survival, built by people who never saw a thermometer, yet understood with total clarity exactly what the cold demanded of them. Chapter 23: France and the Low Countries. Across the fertile plains of medieval France and the densely settled towns of Flanders, winter posed a different balance of dangers than in the far north or east. Milder on average than Scandinavia or Russia, this region was nonetheless vulnerable precisely because its people had built their lives around gentler expectations. Farmhouses in Normandy, Picardy, and the surrounding countryside were often built with less extreme insulation than their northern counterparts, relying on moderate wall thickness and mortise thatching rather than in the deep turf roofs or semi-buried construction found further north. When a genuinely severe winter did strike, the consequences could be sharper for exactly this reason. A population and a built environment less rehearsed in extremity found itself less prepared to absorb it. In the cloth-producing towns of Flanders, a different kind of vulnerability emerged. Dense urban populations dependent on grain shipped in from the surrounding countryside, so that a hard winter affecting rural harvests and transport alike could tighten food supplies in the towns even before the cold itself became the primary danger. Peasant households on manorial estates across this region still relied on the same fundamental toolkit described earlier: shared sleeping, layered wool, careful fuel management, but applied with a different calculation, prepared for an average winter rather than an extreme one, and therefore tested most severely in precisely those years when the climate exceeded what recent memory had taught them to expect. Chapter 24: The Iberian Frontier. In the Iberian Peninsula, winter's character shifted dramatically with elevation and region. Along the southern coasts and lowlands, cold posed a far milder threat than almost anywhere else discussed in this account. Yet the interior plateau and the mountain ranges running through the peninsula told a very different story. Villages in the higher elevations of Castile, Leon, and the Pyrenean foothills faced winters closer in severity to alpine conditions than to the mild Mediterranean image often associated with the region. Stone construction, thick-walled and low-roofed, dominated these highland villages, echoing solutions found in other cold mountain communities across Europe. The particular history of the Iberian frontier, land contested for centuries between Christian and Muslim rule during the period of the Reconquista, added a further layer of complexity to winter survival, as frontier settlements sometimes existed in a state of seasonal military tension alongside the ordinary demands of the cold. Villages positioned near contested borders had to balance stockpiling food and fuel against the risk of raids or displacement, a reminder that in some parts of medieval Europe, surviving winter meant contending not only with nature, but with the unpredictable rhythms of conflict layered on top of it. Chapter 25: Merchant Cities of the Baltic. Along the Baltic coast, a network of trading towns bound together under the Hanseatic League developed a winter experience distinct from the rural peasantry, though closely connected to it through trade. Cities such as Lubac, Danzig, and Riga depended heavily on the surrounding countryside for grain, firewood, and furs, meaning the fate of rural peasant households and urban merchant communities were tied together, even as their daily winter experience differed sharply. Sea ice could close Baltic harbors for months at a time, halting the trade routes these cities depended upon and forcing careful advance planning for supplies that could no longer be replenished once the freeze set in. Urban households, generally wealthier and living in denser, taller timber and brick buildings, faced different insulation challenges than isolated rural farmsteads, yet shared the same fundamental reliance on stored fuel, layered wool, and careful hearth management. Furs, a major commodity of Baltic and Russian trade, moved along these same frozen routes toward wealthier markets further west and south, a reminder that the very materials which kept peasant households warm in the harshest interior regions were also valuable goods within a much wider medieval economy, one that connected the coldest corners of Europe to its warmest trading centers. Chapter 26: The Great Famine. Among the documented crises of the medieval period, the years 1315 through 1317 stand out with particular severity. A stretch of catastrophic weather across much of northern Europe, now remembered as the Great Famine. Unusually heavy and sustained rainfall through the growing seasons of these years rotted crops in the fields, while the winters that followed arrived on top of already depleted stores, turning ordinary seasonal hardship into a continent-wide crisis. Chroniclers writing during these years described price spikes for grain reaching levels far beyond what ordinary households could afford, livestock dying in numbers severe enough to disrupt farming for years afterward, and reports, treated with the appropriate historical caution by modern scholars, of desperate acts committed by starving populations in the hardest-hit regions. For peasant households already stretched thin by these conditions, the added burden of severe winter cold, arriving on top of famine, represented a compounding crisis that the household-level strategies described throughout this account, stored fuel, shared body heat, careful rationing, could only partially offset. The Great Famine left a lasting mark on medieval demographic and economic history, a stark reminder that the systems peasant communities built against winter cold operated within a wider, more fragile web of harvest, weather, and subsistence that could fail on multiple fronts at once. Chapter 27: The Hard Winters of the 15th Century. Later medieval chronicles record a further series of exceptionally severe winters during the 15th century, a period when Little Ice Age conditions continued to intensify across much of Europe. Accounts from the 1430s describe extended freezes affecting major rivers across France and the Low Countries, disrupting the waterborne trade and milling operations that many communities depended upon even in winter. Grain mills powered by water could not operate when rivers froze solid, forcing communities to fall back on hand milling or travel to distant mills still able to function, adding labor and time to the basic task of turning stored grain into usable flour at precisely the moment when time and energy were most precious. Vineyards across parts of France and Germany, already operating near the northern limit of where grapes could reliably be grown, suffered repeated frost damage during this period, a slow economic pressure layered on top of the immediate danger the cold posed to human life. Village and memorial records from these decades show increased reliance on the cooperative measures described earlier, shared grain stores, communal firewood distribution, and mutual aid between households, evidence that repeated exposure to severe winters had, by this point in the medieval period, produced increasingly refined and formalized community responses to a threat that recurred with grim regularity. Chapter 28: Preserving the Harvest Against the Freeze. Surviving winter depended as much on what had been done in the months before the frost as on anything attempted once the cold arrived, and food preservation stood among the most critical of these advanced preparations. Salting was among the most widely used techniques across medieval Europe, applied to meat and fish alike, drawing moisture out of the flesh and creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that would otherwise cause spoilage. Smoking served a similar purpose, particularly for meat and certain fish. exposing the flesh to prolonged low heat and smoke that both dried it and imparted compounds which further slowed decay. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, and in their medieval centuries carrots, were valued precisely because they could be stored for months in cool, dark conditions without significant spoilage, forming a critical part of the winter diet described in earlier chapters. Grain itself required careful management, threshed and stored in dry conditions to prevent mold and protect it as best as possible from rodents and damp, since a household's entire winter survival could depend on grain reserves remaining edible across many months of storage. These preservation techniques, practiced and refined across generations, transformed a single autumn harvest into a resource capable of sustaining a family through the entire span of a long, cold winter. Chapter 29, The Cellar Beneath the House. Where the climate and soil allowed, medieval households dug storage cellars beneath or beside their homes, taking advantage of the same principle that made semi-buried dwellings effective in the coldest regions, the relatively stable temperature of earth below the frost line. These cellars protected root vegetables, stored grain, salted meat, and other preserved foods from both the killing frost of deep winter and the spoiling warmth that could threaten stores in milder stretches of the season. Some cellars were simple earthen pits lined with straw or wood, while wealthier households, or those in stone-building regions, constructed more elaborate stone-lined storage spaces capable of holding a family's entire winter reserve. Access to a well-built cellar could represent a meaningful advantage between households of similar overall wealth, since poorly stored food that spoiled partway through winter posed a threat every bit as serious as an insufficient harvest in the first place. The careful management of these stores, deciding what to eat first, what could last longest, powder ration supplies against an uncertain number of remaining cold weeks, fell typically to the senior woman of the household, whose judgment in this quiet, unglamorous task could prove as vital to a family's survival as any other skill described throughout this account. Chapter 30, Work That Never Stopped. Winter did not mean idleness for medieval peasant households, even as outdoor agricultural labor slowed dramatically once fields lay frozen or snow-covered. Indoor tasks filled the season instead, spinning and weaving wool, as described earlier, but also the repair and maintenance of tools, carts, and farm equipment that would be needed again once the thaw arrived. Wooden implements were mended, metal tools sharpened or brought to a local blacksmith for repair, and baskets, rope, and other essential household items woven or braided from stored materials during the long indoor hours. Woodworking, carving spoons, bowls, and simple furniture filled evenings for many households, producing both practical goods and, where surplus allowed, items that might be traded or sold once travel became possible again in spring. Children were far from exempt from this winter labor. Assigned tasks suited to smaller hands, carding wool, tending the fire, or minding younger siblings, ensuring that even the youngest members of a household contributed to the collective effort of both surviving winter and preparing for the season that would follow it. Far from a period of rest, winter in a medieval peasant household was simply agricultural labor's counterpart, no less demanding, but reshaped entirely around the indoor tasks the season allowed. Chapter 31, The Blacksmith's Winter Forge. Village blacksmiths occupied a particularly important role during the coldest months, their forges representing one of the few sources of intense, sustained heat available within a rural community outside the household hearth itself. Beyond producing and repairing the metal tools essential to farming, smiths in the depths of winter sometimes found their workshops serving an informal secondary purpose, a gathering point where villagers might linger briefly in the warmth while waiting for a repair or simply exchanging news during a season that otherwise limited social contact between households. The demand for a smith's work did not disappear in winter. Broken plow blades, damaged cart fittings, and worn tools all needed attention before spring planting resumed, meaning the forge fire burned through the cold months as a matter of ongoing economic necessity as much as comfort. Charcoal, carefully produced and stored for exactly this purpose, fueled these forges, representing another category of fuel preparation that had to be completed well in advance of the season in which it would be needed. The blacksmith's continued operation through winter stood as a quiet but essential thread connecting a village's cold season survival to its readiness for the agricultural labor that would resume the moment the ground finally thawed. Chapter 32: Water when everything freezes. Even the most basic resource of daily life, water, became a genuine challenge once deep winter set in. Wells could freeze at their surface or, in the most extreme cold, deeper within their shafts, forcing households to break through ice each morning, simply to draw the water needed for cooking, drinking, and the care of livestock. Rivers and streams, when not frozen solid, still demanded caution to approach safely, and in the coldest regions, communities sometimes cut and stored blocks of river or lake ice during the depths of winter, packed in straw within an insulated storage space, preserving it for use through the following warmer months, an early and practical form of refrigeration, built entirely from careful timing and available materials. Melting snow provided an alternative water source in many households, though it required additional fuel to heat, a cost that had to be weighed carefully against already limited firewood reserves. The seemingly simple task of securing enough water for a household and its animals through the coldest weeks added yet another layer of labor to a season already defined by constant, careful effort. One more example of how thoroughly medieval winter reshaped even the most ordinary elements of daily survival. Chapter 33: A world sealed by snow. Deep snow and frozen ground could isolate a medieval village from the wider world for weeks or even months at a time, cutting off travel, trade, and communication in ways that shaped both practical survival and the rhythm of daily life. Roads, often little more than dirt tracks even in good weather, became impassable once buried under significant snowfall, and the rivers that served as vital transport route in milder seasons could freeze solid or become dangerously unstable to cross. This isolation carried real consequences. A household or village facing an unexpected shortage, whether of food, fuel, or medical necessity, could not simply send for help or supplies from outside until conditions improved, reinforcing the importance of the thorough advance preparation described throughout this account. Yet isolation also carried a certain protective quality in less obvious ways, limiting the spread of disease between communities during a season when illness, worsened by cold and cramped indoor living, already posed a heightened danger. News of distant events, whether political developments, market prices, or simply news of family in other villages, arrived only once travel resumed, meaning a community's understanding of the wider world during the depths of winter often lagged weeks or months behind actual events, a strange kind of stillness settling over medieval life each year until the roads opened again. Chapter 34: Racing the First Frost. The weeks immediately before winter's true arrival carried a particular intensity in medieval peasant life, a final concentrated push to complete every preparation before the ground froze and travel became difficult. Local markets in the late autumn saw increased activity, households trading surplus goods for items they lacked, securing salt for preservation, purchasing additional wool or finished cloth if their own production had fallen short, and settling accounts before the season of limited mobility began. Livestock decisions reached their final and most consequential stage during this window, determining precisely which animals could be fed through the winter and which would need to be slaughtered their meat preserved rather than their upkeep continued through months, when fodder itself might run short. Roofs were inspected and repaired, gaps in walls sealed with fresh clay or moss, and any remaining outdoor tasks, from firewood splitting to the final harvest of hardy late-season vegetables, pushed to completion with mounting urgency as the days shortened and the first hard frosts began to appear. This period represented, in many ways, the true test of a household's foresight, since the quality and thoroughness of these final autumn preparations often determined more than anything else how comfortably, or how desperately, a family would pass through the winter that followed. Chapter 35, Enduring the Long Dark. Beyond the physical measures of shelter, clothing, and food, surviving a medieval winter demanded something less tangible, but equally essential: the psychological endurance to withstand months of confinement, darkness, and uncertainty. Shortened daylight hours, particularly severe in the higher latitudes of northern Europe, compressed the useful working day and left long stretches of darkness to be filled within the confines of a single crowded room. Communities developed rhythms and routines that helped structure this confinement: storytelling and shared tasks by firelight, the observance of religious and seasonal festivals described earlier, and the simple, steady rhythm of daily chores that gave shape and purpose to otherwise monotonous stretches of enforced indoor life. Patience, in a very real and practical sense, functioned as a survival skill alongside the physical preparations this account has described, since households that maintained careful discipline in rationing food and fuel across an uncertain number of remaining winter weeks fared better than those who consumed resources too quickly in the season's earlier, seemingly less severe stretches. Medieval winter asked not only for physical preparation, but for a kind of sustained, collective patience, a willingness to endure discomfort and uncertainty together, trusting in preparations made months earlier, and in the eventual, inevitable return of spring. Chapter 36, What the Thaw Revealed. When spring finally arrived, its signs were read carefully by communities whose survival had just been tested by the months before. Melting snow revealed the true condition of stores, fields, and structures, often exposing damage or losses that had gone unseen beneath winter's cover. Livestock that had survived emerged thin and weakened, requiring careful management as fresh grazing slowly returned. Fields needed to be assessed, prepared, and planted with a fresh urgency, the entire agricultural cycle beginning anew, even as households were still recovering from the physical and material toll of the winter just endured. Yet the arrival of spring also carried genuine relief and renewal, a lifting of the isolation, confinement, and constant vigilance that winter had demanded, and a return to the wider rhythms of trade, travel, and community contact that the coldest months had suspended. For medieval peasant communities, particularly in the regions and years described throughout this account, each successful passage through winter represented not merely survival, but the successful execution of a deeply refined system of knowledge, one built and rebuilt across generations, tested against nature's harshest extremes and carried forward, season after season, by people whose quiet mastery of their environment deserves to be remembered with genuine respect rather than dismissed as simple hardship. Thank you for watching my channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. See you in my other videos.